Lian and the Unicorn. Long ago, Lian lived in the Chinese emperor's palace and helped her parents prepare food in the imperial kitchens. In all of her 14 years, she had never met the prince. Oh, she'd caught an occasional glimpse of him here and there and could see he was handsome and always surrounded by friends and attendants. And she'd certainly helped prepare food for his many parties and banquets. But unlike the emperor, who made a point of thanking the kitchen staff at the beginning of the New Year festival, or the empress, who gave the palace servants presents on their birthdays, the prince was always too busy to come to the kitchen. That was why Lian was surprised to see him one spring afternoon when she was out in the meadow collecting flowers and blossoms for the emperor's dinner table. As he walked closer to her, Lian could see that the prince was even more handsome than she had thought. He wore a fine silk robe woven in red thread for happiness and a silk jacket embroidered with dragons. Suddenly, she was very conscious of the grass stains on the knees of her simple servant's robe and of the way her hair was coming loose from its braid. "Your Imperial Majesty," she greeted the prince, bowing low. The prince put a finger to his lips, but then shook his head. "Too late," he said. "Too late for what, Your Majesty?" Lian asked, bowing again. "A deer was standing at the edge of the trees," the prince explained. "It ran away when you spoke." Lian nodded. "Many animals come to the meadow when I'm working quietly. Badgers, squirrels, deer, and unicorns?" interrupted the prince. "Yes," Lian said, surprised that he had asked. "I've never seen a unicorn," the prince said, "no matter how quiet I am." "Ah," Lian said, "that's because unicorns don't like quiet. They like music." "Music? What do you mean?" Lian put down her basket of flowers and reached into the sleeve of her robe. She pulled out the little wooden flute the empress had given her on her 10th birthday. Then she sat down on the soft grass and played a gentle tune. "It's very pretty," the prince said as he sat down next to her. "Continue." "But I have flowers to gather and pots to scrub and—" the prince waved airily. "Someone else can do that. Play." He was, after all, the prince, so Lian played, and played and played, until suddenly she heard the prince take in a sharp breath. Lian looked up and saw a unicorn peeking out from between two trees on the edge of the meadow. "Continue," the prince whispered. Lian kept playing, and the unicorn came closer, closer than any unicorn had ever come to her before. Lian decided the reason was that her music sounded so happy. After all, she was sitting here in the meadow next to the prince himself. The unicorn came closer still. Lian caught her own breath in amazement and almost missed a note, for up close the creature was more beautiful than she'd imagined. It was the size of a small horse, pure white with a horn that looked as much like gold as anything she'd seen in the palace, and its eyes were green, the color of jade. She saw that clearly because the unicorn was looking directly at her. "Keep playing," the prince told her, his voice the barest whisper. The unicorn tossed its head and stamped its feet as though nervous, but still came closer, until it stood right before Lian and the prince. Then the unicorn lay down in the grass at their feet, listening to Lian's music, smelling of wildflowers. Lian could not resist the urge to reach out and pet it. Its mane was as soft as it looked. The unicorn shivered, but otherwise remained motionless. Lian caught a glimpse of some people watching at the edge of the meadow. Before she could ask him who they were, the prince said, "Keep playing. They are my attendants." Lian couldn't understand why so many of the prince's servants were nearby. She looked back at the prince and saw that he now held a length of rope, which he had kept concealed in his jacket pocket. Lian took the flute from her lips. "No," she said, even though she was talking to the emperor's son. Suddenly the flute felt like ice in her hands, but it was too late. The prince dropped a loop of rope around the unicorn's neck, but the unicorn still didn't move and looked only at her. "Thank you," the prince said to her as though she had wanted to help. "I'm sorry," Lian whispered, bending forward to the unicorn's ear. Did unicorns understand human speech? She found the courage to glare at the prince. "You won't harm it, will you?" she asked, feeling guilty about her role in the capture. "Of course not," the prince said. "I want to build a zoo. It will have one of every species of bird and animal that lives in my father's empire, but the unicorn will be my most prized attraction." Lian thought the unicorn looked much better in the meadow than it ever would in a zoo. "I'm sorry," she told the creature again. "You're being silly," the prince snapped as his men came out from hiding among the trees and gathered around him. They congratulated him and shouted, "Well done!" a compliment Lian did not think he deserved. Then the prince tried to leave, but the unicorn wouldn't get up, no matter how hard the prince tugged on the rope. When she saw that the prince wouldn't give up and the unicorn would get hurt, Lian bowed and said, "Your Majesty, allow me." The unicorn got to its feet when she took the rope. As she led the unicorn through the woods and back toward the palace, Lian thought about the prince. Now that she had finally met him, she was sorely disappointed. The prince was so delighted with the unicorn. He gave Lian's family 3 gold pieces. Together with the money her parents had been saving, they had enough to retire from the imperial kitchens and buy a tea house near the palace. You must visit the palace every day, the prince commanded Lian. Lian realized he didn't want her to visit him. He only wanted her there to tame the unicorn. Day after day, Lian walked from the tea house to the palace. Day after day, she watched the prince harness the unicorn to a specially designed wagon that he would ride in so people throughout the land could admire him and gape at his unicorn. Day after day, she grew angrier. One day, the prince was out until after dark. Watching from the shadows, Lian noticed that the unicorn was covered with mud and could barely walk. As the prince unhitched the wagon and led the tired unicorn to its pen, Lian thought, unicorns are the symbol of wisdom. This prince is foolish. Once the stable boy locked the unicorn in its pen and returned the key to the prince, Lian came out and stood by the gate. As soon as the unicorn saw her, it raised its tired head and stood proudly for her. Lian knew what she had to do. She climbed over the wall. It was high enough to keep a horse from getting out, but as everyone knows, a unicorn is very different than a horse. She jumped down into the pen, and the unicorn immediately came over to greet her. You poor creature, Lian said. I'm here to rescue you. The unicorn looked at the gate. Maybe it can understand me, she thought. But when she said, I don't have the key, you'll have to jump the wall, the unicorn didn't seem to understand her. It didn't look at the wall, it only looked at her. Lian gently took the unicorn's head in her hands and turned it in the direction of the wall. Jump, she said, making shooing motions. Instead, the unicorn got down on its knees and gently nuzzled her leg. Was the unicorn inviting her to get on its back? Being a kitchen servant, Lian had never ridden on a horse. Nevertheless, she climbed on the unicorn's back, her arms securely around its neck, and whispered, Ready, in its ear. Carefully, the unicorn got up on its feet and slowly circled the pen, allowing Lian to get used to its gait. It circled faster and faster. Suddenly, they were galloping at full speed toward the wall. Lian held on tight and closed her eyes. Then they were off the ground, flying over the wall. After what seemed an impossibly long time, they hit the ground, still running, and gradually slowed down. They were on the other side. Lian thought they'd head for the forest, but the unicorn circled around to the back of the palace instead, to the smaller pens and cages, where the prince kept the animals he'd captured while his zoo was being built. Of course, Lian thought. They need to be rescued too. As the unicorn walked up to the nearest cage, Lian leaned over and unhooked the latch. The cages were not locked because the prince wasn't worried about anyone stealing common animals. The unicorn walked her around the courtyard as she leaned over to unfasten the latches and open every cage. She released a panda, a tree shrew, a tiger, a fox, a goat, and 3 different kinds of monkeys. Instead of running away, the animals waited for her to finish opening the rest of the cages. Once Lian set free all the animals, the unicorn led them to the edge of the forest. Even the birds didn't stray far ahead, but kept circling back to keep pace with the easily distracted rabbit. Only when they were under the cover of forest did the animals finally scatter silently. Lian slid off the unicorn and gave it a hug. The unicorn rested its head against her shoulder. It was a wonderful ride, she said, but you need to go. As everyone knows, unicorns are meant to be free. The unicorn looked at her one final time with those beautiful jade-colored eyes, turned and disappeared into the darkness between the trees. No one ever suspected Lian, the tea house owner's daughter, of helping the imperial zoo animals to escape. After all, the gate to the unicorn's pen was still locked, and only unicorn tracks were visible among the opened zoo cages. Obviously, unicorn magic was involved. Everyone blamed the prince for having kept the unicorn out all day and away from Lian. They figured her taming effect had worn off. The prince, who, like the rabbit, was easily distracted, never did resume work on his zoo, and no one ever seemed to notice that in the early morning dew, unicorn tracks were sometimes visible on the grass between the new tea house and the forest. Some tracks were light, the way unicorn tracks usually are, but some were deeper, heavier, almost as though the unicorn carried a rider. But as everyone knows, no one can ride a unicorn.